There are many dangerous species in the galaxy. Some possess claws strong enough to rip through armored hulls. Others breathe toxins capable of dissolving flesh in seconds. Entire wars have been fought over the fear of such creatures. But none of them unsettle the Galactic Coalition the way humans do. It is not because humans are physically impressive. In truth, they are rather unimposing. Soft skin, fragile bones, limited natural weaponry. By every biological metric used by the Coalition's evolutionary scholars, the human species should never have survived its homeworld. Yet they did. And that is what terrifies us. I have served the Galactic Council for 212 cycles. I have negotiated treaties between predator empires and prey civilizations. I have witnessed planets burn because two species disagreed about territorial boundaries. But nothing in my career has produced the same quiet dread that fills a council chamber whenever the subject of humanity arises. Humans come from a place they call Earth. To most civilized species, the planet would be classified as a death world, an environment so violently unstable that long-term survival would be statistically improbable. Extreme gravity, unpredictable climate, predators in every ecosystem, geological disasters frequent enough to erase entire cities. And yet, humans not only survived, they flourished. Coalition academies teach new recruits a simple guideline when dealing with Deathworld species: exercise caution. Deathworlders evolve under constant threat. They develop instincts that civilized species abandoned long ago. Humans, however, go beyond caution. Our training manuals use a far more specific instruction: do not provoke them. Few cadets understand why. They assume the warning refers to human warfare. And to be fair, human wars are disturbing. Their conflicts are chaotic, emotional, and devastatingly efficient. Humans have a peculiar ability to weaponize anything within reach. Tools become weapons, vehicles become weapons, even their own bodies become weapons. But war is not what truly defines humanity. No, the defining trait of the human species is something far stranger: loyalty. Humans form bonds with an intensity rarely observed elsewhere in the galaxy. Their families are not merely social units. They are sacred structures. Parents protect offspring with ferocity that defies rational calculation. Siblings defend each other even when the odds guarantee death. And children occupy a place in human culture that many alien civilizations struggle to comprehend. To a human, a child is not simply young. A child is protected. Protected by law, protected by tradition, protected by instinct older than their recorded history. I remember the first time I encountered this concept during diplomatic briefings. A human ambassador explained it with a calmness that, in hindsight, should have alarmed us. We assumed he was exaggerating. In diplomacy, such dramatics are common.
But humans are not known for idle words. Unfortunately, arrogance often flourishes within the Galactic Council. Powerful species begin to believe their own propaganda. They convince themselves that younger civilizations exist merely to follow their rules. And when arrogance meets ignorance, history tends to suffer. The chain of events that would forever alter humanity's reputation began with a single officer. He belonged to the Carthan Dominion, a species physically superior to humans in almost every measurable way. Taller, stronger, armored exoskeletons capable of deflecting small arms fire. Their empire had enforced coalition law for generations. Naturally, such authority breeds confidence. Sometimes too much. The officer in question had recently received his first independent assignment: enforcement oversight on a remote colony world known as Larkus. Larkus was insignificant by most standards, a modest trade hub on the edge of coalition territory. Its population consisted of several minor species, including a small human community that had arrived decades earlier to establish agricultural operations. There were no major industries, no strategic resources, no military installations. Just farmers, merchants, mechanics, the sort of quiet colony that rarely appears in official reports, which made the officer's task seem almost insulting. A minor taxation dispute had arisen. The human settlement had failed to deliver a shipment of agricultural exports on schedule, delaying their mandatory contribution to coalition tariffs. It was bureaucratic nonsense, but the council had recently become obsessed with maintaining strict regulatory compliance among frontier colonies. In truth, the assignment was little more than a warning visit. Deliver the decree, collect the payment, demonstrate authority. Routine procedure. Yet the officer viewed it differently. To him, humans were primitive Deathworlders, barely tolerated within civilized society. Their emotional behavior and stubborn independence irritated many within the Dominion. And the warnings surrounding them? He considered them ridiculous. During the pre-deployment briefing, one senior advisor attempted to caution him. Humans respond poorly to intimidation, the advisor said carefully. The officer laughed. Then they will learn, he replied. That arrogance would prove catastrophic. When his enforcement cruiser descended into the atmosphere of Larkus Colony, no alarm sounded. The human settlement welcomed visitors regularly. Cargo ships arrived every few days. No one expected trouble. The colony square was calm when the officer arrived. Humans moved about their daily routines. Repair drones hovered between cargo containers. Children played near supply crates while adults negotiated trade shipments. Normal life. Peaceful life. To the officer, however, the scene appeared disrespectful. No one bowed. No one knelt. No one seemed particularly concerned that a representative of the coalition had arrived.
He interpreted their calmness as defiance, and so he decided to demonstrate authority. The officer stepped into the center of the square, towering above the gathered colonists. His armored limbs clanged against the metal ground plating as he activated the translation field. Humans paused. Several looked up from their work. One elderly farmer approached slowly, wiping dust from his hands. "We had a shipment failure," the man explained politely. "The cargo vessel never arrived." The officer heard the words, but he did not hear the meaning. In his mind, this was an excuse, and humans, he believed, needed to be reminded of their place. What none of us realized in that moment, what the officer certainly did not realize, was that history had already begun shifting. Because somewhere in that quiet colony square, a small human child was watching. And within the next few minutes, the officer would make the worst mistake of his entire career. The kind of mistake that spreads through a species like wildfire. The kind of mistake that awakens instincts older than civilization itself. The kind of mistake that teaches the galaxy a lesson it will never forget. Because on Larkus Colony, a human child was about to meet an officer who had never learned the most important rule of dealing with humanity. And soon, the entire galaxy would pay the price. Frontier colonies often exist in a strange quiet. They are far from the centers of power, far from the glittering capital worlds where laws are debated and empires posture. Out here, life is simpler. Survival depends less on politics and more on cooperation. Larkus Colony was exactly that kind of place. A trading outpost resting on the edge of coalition space, its landing pads were rarely crowded. Cargo freighters came and went. Farmers exported grain. Mechanics repaired aging vessels that passed through the sector. Humans had settled there decades earlier. Not because the world was easy, but because it wasn't. The planet possessed slightly higher gravity than most coalition worlds. The climate shifted violently between scorching summers and brutal winters. Dust storms could swallow entire convoys without warning. Most civilized species avoided such environments. Humans, however, seemed to prefer them. Perhaps that is why no one paid much attention to the small human settlement on Larkus. They were farmers, technicians, engineers, people who worked quietly and asked for very little from the wider galaxy. Until the day an enforcement cruiser appeared in the sky. Its descent was impossible to ignore. The vessel broke through the clouds like a blade slicing open the atmosphere, engines roaring as it lowered toward the colony's landing zone. Citizens looked up from their tasks as the ship's shadow passed across the square. To most species, such a display would have triggered panic, but the humans simply watched. Curious. Patient. The cruiser settled onto the landing pad with mechanical precision. Moments later, its main hatch opened and the officer stepped out. Behind him floated a formation of enforcement drones, 6 hovering machines armed with stun emitters and surveillance arrays. Their polished chassis reflected the colony lights as they scanned the surrounding area. A show of force. The officer clearly intended it to be impressive. He marched toward the colony square with deliberate, heavy steps. His armored limbs struck the metal plating with sharp metallic echoes, each impact announcing his authority. The drones followed in silent formation. By the time he reached the center of the square, several colonists had gathered nearby. Humans. A few traders from other species. No one appeared particularly frightened, which irritated the officer immediately.
He activated the translation field mounted along his collar. The words echoed across the plaza. Humans glanced at one another. An older man stepped forward, the same farmer who had spoken earlier. His posture was relaxed, respectful but not submissive. "There's been a misunderstanding," the man said calmly. "Our export shipment never arrived." The officer's compound eyes narrowed slightly. "I see no approved exemption on record," he replied. "We're waiting on confirmation from the shipping guild," the man answered. Simple explanation. Reasonable explanation. But the officer did not travel across half a sector to hear excuses. He began walking slowly through the square, inspecting the settlement as though searching for proof of wrongdoing. His drones drifted overhead, scanning cargo containers, storage units, and machinery. Humans continued their work. Some returned to loading equipment. Others simply watched the officer with quiet curiosity. That calmness began to bother him. Most species reacted to authority with visible nervousness. They lowered their gaze. They spoke carefully. Humans did neither. They observed him, measured him, as though he were the one being inspected. The officer turned sharply, letting his gaze sweep across the gathered colonists. And that was when he noticed her. A small human child stood near a stack of supply crates. She was tiny compared to the towering alien officer, barely reaching the height of his lower limbs. Her clothing was dusty from playing in the square. One hand rested against the side of a cargo container. But what captured the officer's attention was her expression. She wasn't afraid. She was simply watching him. Curious. Her dark eyes followed his movements as if he were an interesting animal that had wandered into the colony. The officer stopped walking. For reasons he could not quite explain, the child's gaze unsettled him. Children from most species reacted instinctively to danger. They hid behind adults. They fled from unfamiliar predators. This one did neither. She simply stood there, studying him. The officer's irritation sharpened. "You," he said, pointing one armored limb toward her.
The translation field carried his voice across the square. The girl tilted her head slightly. She did not move. Several nearby humans noticed the exchange. A woman across the plaza paused beside a supply cart, watching carefully. The officer stepped closer. "I said move," he repeated, his voice growing harsher. Still, the girl remained where she was. Perhaps she didn't understand the command. Or perhaps she simply didn't see any reason to obey. To the officer, however, her stillness felt like defiance. A child, barely more than an infant by coalition standards, ignoring a Dominion officer. Ignoring authority. Ignoring him. Something inside his mind snapped. The movement happened so quickly that most witnesses later struggled to describe it. The officer swung one armored limb forward. Not with lethal force, but with enough strength to shove the child aside. The impact produced a sharp metallic sound. The girl's small body lifted off the ground and slammed against the metal plating of the colony square. The sound echoed. Then everything stopped. The plaza fell into absolute silence. No machinery moved. No one spoke. The officer lowered his limb slowly, expecting the reaction he had seen countless times before. Fear. Panic. Submission. But none of those things appeared. Instead, the humans moved toward the girl. Quietly. 3 adults knelt beside her where she lay on the ground. One checked her breathing. Another gently lifted her head. Blood trickled from a cut along her forehead. The woman from earlier arrived seconds later, her hands trembling as she brushed dust from the child's clothing. But her face was calm. Every human face in that plaza looked calm. Too calm. The officer felt an unfamiliar sensation ripple through his instincts. Unease. He had expected shouting, arguments, maybe even violence. Instead, the humans simply focused on the child. They spoke to each other in soft voices. One man removed a communication device from his belt. He typed a short message. Then another human did the same. Within seconds, dozens of silent transmissions left the colony. No alarm sounded. No threats were made. Just messages. Tiny signals slipping quietly into the vast networks of human space. I did not witness this moment personally, but later intelligence reportings allowed us to reconstruct what happened next. The messages were short. Identical. Only 4 words long. 4 words that would spread across human settlements faster than any military order.
across mining stations, across merchant fleets, across distant colonies and orbital habitats. Those words carried a meaning older than any government, older than human civilization itself. And in that moment, something ancient awakened inside the human species. Something that had evolved on a world where protecting the young often meant fighting predators with bare hands. Something that did not care about politics, or laws, or interstellar diplomacy.
The officer looked around the silent plaza, suddenly uncertain why the air felt heavier, why every human in the square had stopped speaking, why they were looking at him with an expression he could not quite identify. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was something far more unsettling. Recognition. As though they already knew what would happen next. As though the officer had just triggered a chain of events that could no longer be stopped. And far beyond the quiet colony of Larkus, human ships had already begun to move. At first, no one in the Galactic Council noticed. Frontier incidents occur every cycle. Small disputes, minor enforcement actions, a damaged cargo vessel here, a trade disagreement there. The bureaucracy of the Coalition processes thousands of such reports daily. The Larkus incident should have been just another entry in an endless archive. But then the signals began. I remember the moment clearly because I was present in the intelligence chamber when the first anomaly appeared. A junior analyst had flagged an unusual burst of encrypted traffic leaving the Larkus system. At first, we assumed it was routine distress communication. Frontier colonies often rely on emergency channels when equipment fails or shipments are delayed. Nothing about the initial transmission seemed remarkable. But then another message appeared, then another, and another. Within minutes, dozens of identical signals were detected, spreading through the communication lattice that connected human settlements across that region of space. The analyst frowned at her display. I leaned closer to examine the data. The messages were encrypted using human civilian protocols. Nothing military, nothing aggressive. But the transmission priority was unusually high, higher than most emergency distress calls. "What are the encrypted messages saying?" I asked. The analyst swallowed slightly. "They are just a single 128-byte string. I don't understand." Across nearby star systems, human outposts began receiving the same short transmission. Mining stations, cargo vessels, agricultural colonies, orbital shipyards, even long-distance merchant convoys traveling beyond Coalition jurisdiction. All of them received the same message, and all of them reacted. At first, the changes were subtle. A merchant vessel diverted from its scheduled trade route and accelerated to the Larkus sector. A mining platform shut down extraction operations hours earlier than planned. A long-range cargo convoy transmitted an unexpected course correction. Individually, none of these actions appeared alarming. But as the hours passed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Human ships were changing direction. All of them. And they were all heading toward the same destination, Larkus colony. Coalition analysts began assembling a traffic map of the region. As the display filled with moving signals, the room slowly fell silent. There were far more human vessels in the surrounding sectors than we had realized. Merchant fleets, exploration craft, industrial transports. Civilian vessels operating outside official registries. One by one, their trajectories shifted, like iron filings drawn toward a magnetic field. Someone asked quietly. "No," another analyst replied. Human military forces were easy to track. They used standardized command frequencies and identifiable vessel signatures. This movement was different. It was civilian, uncoordinated, and yet somehow organized. Cargo vessels began unloading commercial freight and converting their internal storage bays into passenger compartments. Mining transports detached drilling equipment and reinforced their hull plating. Even small courier ships altered course to act as navigational escorts. They were improvising, transforming ordinary vessels into something else. Not quite a fleet, but something very close. Still, no official declaration had been issued, no threats transmitted, no diplomatic protests sent to the Council. Humans simply moved. I requested the original message from Larkus. The analyst hesitated. The message appeared on the central display. Simple text, unadorned. No symbols, no explanation. Just 4 words. A child has been harmed. For a moment, no one spoke. Several members of the intelligence staff exchanged confused glances. "What have they done?" one of them asked. "What if they meant?" another added. To most species in the Coalition, the response seemed absurd. Yes, an enforcement officer had struck a child, but accidents happen. Minor injuries occur during law enforcement operations every cycle. Such incidents are normally resolved through administrative review. At worst, the officer might face disciplinary action, hardly the sort of event that would justify mobilizing half a sector of civilian ships. But humans did not view the incident that way, because within human culture, the protection of children is not simply a social expectation. It is a foundational rule, a rule embedded so deeply in their instincts that it overrides nearly every other priority: trade, politics, even war. I had studied human anthropology long enough to recognize what we were witnessing. This was not anger. This was not revenge. This was something older, a biological response that had evolved on a violent planet where survival depended on defending the young against predators. On Earth, if a predator threatened human offspring, the adult response was immediate and overwhelming. The entire community would mobilize. Farmers, workers, soldiers, anyone capable of standing between the child and the threat. And now that same instinct was unfolding across interstellar space. Only instead of spears and torches, they had starships. By the 8th hour after the incident, the traffic map looked less like random movement and more like a converging storm. Human vessels arrived at Larkus in steady waves: merchant freighters, refueling tankers, exploration craft, mining transports. None of them carried military markings, yet they positioned themselves around the system with eerie precision. Coalition tactical analysts began calculating their formation. One officer stared at the display for nearly a full minute before speaking. I asked. He enlarged the holographic map. Lines of projected firing arcs appeared across the system: communication relays, orbital choke points, hyperspace exit vectors. The ships were arranging themselves to control every possible approach to the colony. The analyst leaned back slowly. Someone laughed nervously. The analyst shook his head. He pointed to the outer perimeter where the first arrivals had taken position. He studied the map again before answering. By the 12th hour, more than 40 human vessels surrounded the Larkus system. By the 16th hour, the number had doubled. Still no threats were issued. Still no weapons were activated. The officer responsible for the incident remained on the planet below, unaware that half a sector of human civilization had begun quietly closing around him. From orbit, the arriving ships formed an expanding sphere around the colony world, silent, motionless, watching. Coalition observers attempted to contact them. No response. Requests for explanation were transmitted through diplomatic channels. No reply. It was as if humanity had collectively decided to ignore the rest of the galaxy. Because this matter did not yet involve us. Not directly. Not yet. Hours later, when the first reports reached the Galactic Council, many representatives dismissed the situation as theatrical exaggeration. Humans are emotional creatures, one senator remarked dismissively. Perhaps. But as I watched the growing armada forming around that small frontier colony, I began to feel something I had not experienced in centuries of diplomacy. Fear. Not because the humans were preparing to attack, but because they were not. They had gathered overwhelming force, and then they had chosen to wait. Predators from Deathworlds rarely act impulsively. They observe, they plan, they decide precisely when to strike, and when they finally move, it is usually because the outcome has already been decided. The human fleet surrounding Larkus colony was not there for war. Not yet. They were preparing something else, something far more deliberate, something that would soon be delivered directly to the Galactic Council itself. And when that message arrived, the entire galaxy would finally understand what those 4 words truly meant. The Galactic Council has always believed itself to be the center of civilization. Hundreds of species gather beneath its authority. Laws are written there. Borders are negotiated there. Entire wars have been prevented, or started, within the polished chambers of its great halls. Powerful species sit at the highest tiers of influence. Ancient empires, economic superpowers, military alliances capable of fielding fleets that darken entire star systems. And then, there are the younger species, new arrivals to the interstellar stage. Civilizations still proving their place within the coalition hierarchy. Humanity belonged to this second group. Officially, they were classified as a developing member civilization. Their territory was small, their political influence limited, their fleets modest compared to the dominant powers of the Council. Which is precisely why the early reports from Larkus were dismissed so easily. When the Intelligence Division first presented the situation to the Council chamber, the reaction was not concern, it was amusement. Humans are emotional, one representative said with a dismissive flick of his tendrils. Another counselor emitted a short, clicking laugh. Yes, they have always been dramatic. A single colonial dispute, and suddenly half their merchants decide to travel together. Several others murmured agreement.
The holographic display in the center of the chamber projected the growing formation of human vessels surrounding Larkus colony. To me, the image looked ominous. To them, it looked theatrical. One senator leaned forward in his seat. The intelligence officer hesitated before answering. Then it is irrelevant. Soft murmurs echoed through the chamber. Case closed. But the situation grew more complicated when the enforcement officer himself transmitted his official report. His image appeared above the council floor, projected from the recording he had sent earlier that cycle. Even through the holographic distortion, his confidence was obvious. "The situation on Larkus is stable," he announced firmly. I studied the recording carefully. There was something in his posture that suggested forced composure. Perhaps he sensed the silent fleet above his world, but the officer continued speaking as though nothing unusual had occurred. "The incident involving the human juvenile has been exaggerated," he said. "The child sustained minor injuries but survived the impact." Several council members nodded approvingly.
The human response to this incident is unusual, I continued. Laughter rippled across the chamber. I ignored it. I recommend issuing an immediate formal apology to the human colonies on Larkus, I said. The chamber went silent. Then several councillors began speaking at once. The idea seemed almost insulting to them. One of the senior representatives leaned forward, his voice cold. A few members exchanged amused glances. "Yes, we are aware of their emotional tendencies," one said. "This is not emotion," I answered. But arrogance has always been difficult to challenge in the council. My proposal was formally rejected within minutes. No apology would be issued. No disciplinary review would begin. Instead, the council voted on a different course of action. If humans wished to create a spectacle around Larkus colony, then they would be summoned to explain themselves. A diplomatic message was transmitted to human authorities across their territory. It was not an apology. It was a demand. In other words, we summoned them like unruly children. Days passed, and the human fleet around Larkus continued to grow. 90 ships, then 100, then 130. Still, they did not activate weapons. Still, they issued no threats. They simply maintained their silent formation around the system, watching, waiting. Coalition observers grew increasingly uneasy. Some senators began asking quiet questions about the purpose of the fleet. Others insisted the situation would resolve itself once the humans realized the council would not yield to intimidation. But I had begun studying the formation patterns of the ships surrounding Larkus. Their positioning was precise. Too precise for a spontaneous gathering of civilians. The ships rotated in careful intervals. Supply vessels arrived and departed along calculated routes. Communication signals passed between them in tight, encrypted bursts. It looked less like a protest, and more like preparation. That was when the fear truly began. Because predators from Deathworlds do not announce their intentions with noise and spectacle. They remain silent. They observe their prey. They calculate. And when the moment finally arrives, the strike is swift, final, decisive. As the days passed and the human fleet continued to grow without making a single hostile move, a terrible realization settled into my thoughts. Humanity was not reacting emotionally. They were demonstrating restraint. And restraint from a Deathworld predator is rarely a comforting sign. Somewhere beyond the stars, a human delegation was already traveling toward the council chamber, carrying with them something the galaxy was not yet prepared to see. And when they arrived, the human ship arrived without announcement. No advanced transmission, no escort fleet, no diplomatic fanfare. One moment, the orbital sensors surrounding the council world reported normal traffic patterns, and the next, a small vessel emerged from hyperspace directly above the capital. It was not a warship. That fact became immediately clear. The vessel carried no active weapon signatures. Its hull design matched civilian diplomatic craft registered to human interstellar authorities. Its engines powered down almost the moment it exited hyperspace. It simply drifted into a stable orbit above the council world. Calm, unthreatening, silent. Security Command reacted instantly, of course. Defense satellites pivoted to track the newcomer. Patrol craft moved into position around the vessel, scanning every centimeter of its hull for hidden weapons. They found none. A transmission arrived shortly after. Short, formal. The message identified exactly 3 passengers aboard the vessel. 3. When the report reached the council chamber, confusion rippled through the representatives gathered there. 3? One senator repeated. That is correct, the security officer confirmed. Another counselor leaned back in his seat, emitting a soft sound of amusement. More quiet laughter followed. The council had expected something far more dramatic, an entire convoy of human diplomats arriving to argue their case. Instead, only 3 representatives had come. To most of the chamber, the implication was obvious. Humanity had backed down. The fleet surrounding Larkus was merely symbolic pressure, nothing more. Now the humans had arrived to negotiate their retreat with minimal embarrassment. I did not share that interpretation. Something about the timing of the arrival troubled me. The human fleet still surrounded Larkus colony. More than 100 vessels remained in position. They had not dispersed. They had not altered formation. And yet this small ship had traveled all the way to the council world alone. Why? The council authorized the delegation's landing clearance. Moments later, the human vessel descended toward the capital's diplomatic platform, slipping through the dense network of orbital traffic with quiet precision. Inside the council chamber, the atmosphere shifted from casual amusement to eager anticipation. Representatives from dozens of species filled the seating tiers surrounding the central floor. Observers crowded the upper balconies. Even several high-ranking military officials had arrived to witness the encounter. Everyone wanted to see how the humans would attempt to explain themselves. When the chamber doors finally opened, the entire room fell quiet. 3 humans entered. They wore dark diplomatic attire, simple, unadorned garments that carried no visible insignias of rank or authority. Their footsteps echoed softly across the polished floor as they walked toward the center of the chamber. Their movements were measured, controlled, not hurried, not hesitant, just deliberate. The lead representative was an older human male, his hair streaked with gray. His posture was straight, his gaze steady as he surveyed the vast chamber filled with alien observers. The other 2 humans followed a few steps behind him. None of them spoke. None of them acknowledged the murmurs spreading through the audience. But something about their expressions unsettled me immediately. They were calm, too calm. Not nervous, not defensive, not angry, simply composed, as though the outcome of this meeting had already been decided long before they arrived. The lead human reached the center of the chamber and stopped beside the circular diplomatic platform. In his hands he carried a small metallic container. It was roughly the size of a transport case used for delicate scientific equipment. Smooth surfaces, sealed lid, no markings. He placed it gently on the platform. The faint metallic sound echoed across the chamber. Only then did the council speaker address them. "You stand before the Galactic Council," the speaker announced. His tone was firm but controlled. The lead human looked up slowly. His gaze moved across the assembled representatives. For a moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. Then the human spoke. Just one sentence. The chamber erupted. Voices from every tier began speaking at once. "That matter is under review. The officer reported the child survived. You have no justification for military intimidation. It was clearly an unfortunate misunderstanding." Council representatives rushed to explain the situation from every possible angle. Some attempted diplomacy, others attempted authority. But the humans did not respond. The 3 delegates simply stood there, listening as the chamber filled with arguments and excuses. The lead human's eyes never left the council speaker. Finally, the shouting began to subside. One senator gestured toward the container resting on the platform. "What is inside?" he demanded. The human glanced down at it. For a moment, his expression did not change. Then he placed both hands on the lid. And slowly, he opened it. The chamber fell silent again. Inside the container rested a single object, the severed head of the enforcement officer. His armored exoskeleton had been carefully removed from the upper portion of his neck, exposing the flesh beneath. The expression frozen across his face was one of shock, perhaps even disbelief. Someone in the upper balcony gasped. Another representative recoiled from the sight. For several seconds, no one spoke. The entire chamber stared at the contents of the container. Then the human representative closed the lid. The metallic click echoed softly across the room. When he looked up again, his expression remained perfectly calm. They have already delivered it. No one moved. No one spoke. The meaning behind those words settled over the chamber like a cold shadow. Humanity had not come to negotiate. They had not come to ask the council for justice. They had already delivered it.
The officer responsible for harming the child had been captured, judged,
and executed by the humans themselves. And the head had been brought here not as a threat, but as evidence, proof that the matter had already been resolved. A trembling voice finally broke the silence. The human tilted his head slightly. The answer came so simply that it seemed to drain the air from the room, because suddenly every representative in that chamber realized the same terrifying truth. Humanity had never intended to debate this issue. They had only come to inform us. The human representative rested one hand lightly on the container. Our people informed you of the situation, he continued calmly. His gaze moved across the silent chamber. The implications of those words spread through the chamber like shockwaves. Some species in the galaxy relied on diplomacy. Others relied on military strength. But humans relied on something else entirely. An unbreakable rule older than any law written by the Coalition. If someone harms a human child, humanity responds. And in that moment, standing before the stunned council, the human delegation revealed something even more unsettling. The fleet surrounding Larkus colony had never been there to attack. It had been there, waiting to see how the council would respond. And suddenly, every representative in that chamber understood just how close the galaxy had come to disaster. For several long seconds after the container was closed, the Galactic Council chamber remained utterly silent. No debate, no outrage, no diplomatic outrage disguised as politeness. Just silence. Hundreds of alien representatives stared at the human delegation standing calmly beside the sealed container. Inside it rested the head of a Coalition officer, an officer who only days earlier had stood on a frontier colony believing himself untouchable beneath the authority of the Galactic Council. Now he was evidence. A few representatives shifted uneasily in their seats. Others stared with visible disgust. One counselor from a pacifist species recoiled, his voice trembling. Another senator raised his upper limbs in agitation. Several voices joined the protest. The chamber erupted in chaos once again, but the humans did not respond immediately. They simply waited. Their calmness made the shouting feel strangely hollow. Eventually, the lead human raised one hand slightly, not in a commanding gesture, just enough to signal he wished to speak. And slowly, the chamber quieted again. When he finally spoke, his tone carried no anger, only clarity. "You are mistaken," he said. Several representatives bristled at that. One senator snapped. The human tilted his head slightly. His voice remained steady. The words settled into the chamber like a stone dropped into still water. "A trial." Murmurs spread across the audience. The human continued calmly. Another counselor scoffed. The human's gaze did not waver.
"The officers survived the initial incident," he explained. That revelation triggered a ripple of surprise among the observers. Someone asked. The human folded his hands behind his back. "Our people provided medical treatment for his injuries." Several council members exchanged confused glances. The human continued. I felt a chill move through my thoughts, because the human's tone suggested something very specific. Procedure. Structure. Justice. Not vengeance. Witnesses were gathered, the human said. He gestured slightly toward the container. The chamber remained completely silent now. No one interrupted. No one argued. Because suddenly the situation no longer resembled the chaotic retaliation we had expected from humans. It resembled something else entirely. A court. The human continued speaking. The evidence was reviewed. Surveillance recordings from the colony square were examined. A senator leaned forward. The human answered without hesitation. Several representatives reacted immediately. The human shook his head. A murmur spread across the chamber. The human continued. When asked why he chose to strike the child rather than remove her from the area using nonviolent means, the human paused briefly, then finished the sentence. Silence returned. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Because now the situation was no longer ambiguous. The officer had not acted in confusion. He had not been defending himself. He had acted out of irritation. Against a child. The human representative spoke again. Someone asked. The human's answer was simple. My attention sharpened. Another counselor demanded. The human turned toward the chamber slowly. He paused for continuing. His gaze moved across the representatives seated in their tiers. One senator leaned forward cautiously. The human's answer was quiet. Anyone who deliberately harms a child. He allowed the words to settle in the chamber. The silence that followed was different from the others. Heavier. Because suddenly everyone understood something terrible. This was not a new ruling. It was not a temporary reaction to the Larkus incident. It was an ancient principle embedded deep within human culture. A rule that existed long before humanity ever reached the stars. The human continued calmly. His voice never changed. No one spoke. Not a single representative challenged the statement. Because the certainty in the human's voice made it clear that the decision had never been in doubt. Justice, in this case, had been swift. But what unsettled me most was not the execution. It was the restraint surrounding it. Because slowly, a realization began forming in my mind. The humans had not brought the officer's head to threaten us. They had brought it as proof. Proof that the matter had already been resolved. Proof that the fleet surrounding Larkus colony had not been preparing an attack. I rose slowly from my seat. Your fleet, I said carefully. The human turned toward me.
For the first time since entering the chamber, the human's expression changed slightly. Not anger, not hostility, something colder. The word echoed softly through the chamber. A senator spoke next, his voice suddenly cautious. The human looked around the room, at every representative, at every species, and then he answered. The meaning struck the chamber like a shockwave. If the council had attempted to defend the officer, if we had declared his actions justified, if we had insisted that coalition law protected him despite what he had done, then humanity would have reached a horrifying conclusion. The human continued speaking quietly. If the council had supported him, his eyes moved slowly across the stunned representatives. He paused. No threats followed those words. None were necessary. Because in that moment, every representative in the chamber realized the same truth. The human fleet around Larkus colony had not been preparing for war. They had been preparing for something worse. A war of principle. A war that would not end with treaties or negotiations. A war fought by a species whose most sacred rule had been violated. And suddenly I understood something that made my blood run cold. The council had been only moments away from making the wrong decision. Only moments away from defending a single arrogant officer. And in doing so, we would have turned the entire coalition into an enemy of human children. A mistake the galaxy would not have survived. History rarely announces the moment it changes. Empires fall quietly. Wars begin with misunderstandings. And sometimes the most important turning points in galactic civilization occur inside a silent chamber, beside a small, sealed container. The aftermath of the Larkus incident unfolded faster than anyone in the Galactic Council expected. For the first time in centuries, the chamber that governed hundreds of species was gripped by something unfamiliar: urgency. Within hours of the human delegation's departure, emergency sessions were called, legal committees assembled, diplomatic envoys transmitted frantic communications across coalition space. The message sent to human authorities was carefully worded. Very carefully. The Galactic Council issued a formal condemnation of the enforcement officer responsible for the incident. His actions were declared a violation of coalition conduct standards. A statement of regret was transmitted to the human settlements on Larkus colony. Regret. Not quite an apology, but close enough that the meaning was understood. More importantly,
the Council began drafting new legislation. Within 2 cycles, a revised interstellar statute was introduced, the Juvenile Protection Accord. For the first time in galactic history, the Coalition formally recognized the protected status of juvenile members of every known species. Children, larvae, hatchlings,
Younglings of any civilization under Coalition jurisdiction would now be shielded from harm under the highest level of legal protection. Violations would carry the most severe penalties permitted by interstellar law. Many senators publicly praised the decision as a progressive step for galactic unity. But those of us who had witnessed the human delegation understood the truth. The law had not been written out of moral awakening. It had been written out of fear. Because the Council had glimpsed, for one terrifying moment, what would happen if humanity ever decided the galaxy had become a threat to its children, and no one wished to test that possibility. Meanwhile, far from the polished halls of diplomacy, events around Larkus Colony began to change. The human fleet remained in place for several days after the Council session. More than 100 civilian vessels still surrounded the system in their silent formation. Merchant ships, mining transports, exploration craft. None of them activated weapons. None of them issued threats. They simply waited, watching, observing. Then, once the Council's official statement was transmitted across Coalition networks, the fleet began to disperse. One by one, the ships departed. Cargo vessels resumed trade routes. Mining transports returned to their operations. Exploration craft disappeared back into deep space. Within 48 hours, the sky above Larkus Colony was empty again, as though the Armada had never existed. To outside observers, it looked like the end of a minor diplomatic dispute. But for those of us who had watched it unfold, the meaning was unmistakable. Humanity had demonstrated something the galaxy had never seen before. Not military strength, not technological superiority, something far more unsettling: discipline. Because mobilizing a civilization is easy, stopping it is much harder. And yet humanity had done exactly that. The moment their message had been delivered, the moment the Council acknowledged the crime, they stood down. No retaliation, no escalation. Just silence.
A species whose patience concealed terrifying restraint. And most of all, a species whose love for its children was powerful enough to mobilize an entire civilization within hours. In the decades since that incident, I have often been asked whether the human response was excessive. After all, the officer's actions had injured only one child, one individual among billions. From a purely statistical perspective, the reaction might appear disproportionate. But statistics do not govern human behavior. Principles do. And the principle that guides them is frighteningly simple. Some things are non-negotiable. The protection of their young is one of those things. The galaxy possesses many powerful civilizations. Some have fleets larger than humanity's. Others possess weapons capable of destroying entire star systems. There are species with technologies far beyond human understanding. But power is not measured only in weapons or ships. Sometimes power comes from something far older, something far simpler: conviction. Because a species that believes its young are sacred will fight with a determination few enemies can match. That is the lesson the galaxy learned from Larkus Colony. A lesson recorded quietly in diplomatic archives. A lesson taught without a single shot being fired. And a lesson that every civilization would be wise to remember. You may argue with humans. You may challenge them. You may even fight them in war. But there is one line the galaxy now understands better than ever. One boundary that no intelligent species should ever cross. Never threaten a human child. Because if the galaxy ever forgets that rule, humanity will be ready to remind us.